In this video, we will talk about how to do basic troubleshooting, testing, and monitoring of your Yawman Arrow controller. Let's begin. Hey folks, my name is Thomas Neild. I am the engineering lead for Yawman Flight. We are going to talk about how to do basic troubleshooting, monitoring, and testing with your Yawman Arrow controller. When it comes to monitoring the performance of the controller, obviously the biggest question is, how does it perform in the flight simulator, whether it's Microsoft Flight Simulator, X-Plane, or Infinite Flight? That being said, things can get lost in the translation with the simulator. Profiles may not be set up correctly. Response curves are being manipulated in a way that's causing confusing behaviors. These are topics we will discuss in future videos, but the very first thing to learn is when things aren't working as intended, you should pull up a joystick or gamepad testing screen of some kind, because that is the ultimate source of truth, whether the controller is working properly or not. We will cover how to do this for both Windows and Mac OS. In Windows, click on the Start menu and type in joystick. Click Setup USB Game Controllers. This will bring up the joystick utility screen. You can also bring up this screen by hitting Window key R, then type joy.cpl, then enter. You're going to click on the Yawman Arrow in that list, so if your computer sees it, you will see it listed right there. And if you go to the Test tab, you will see these sliders and buttons and the joystick and the POV. You can move every single one of these controls with your Yawman Arrow to make sure that it is working predictably. Every button should light up, every axis should move and slide back and forth. If you ever have issues in your flight simulator with the controller, you can come to this screen to see what your computer is actually seeing. After all, things can get lost in translation inside the simulator. You can always come back to this screen to see what actually is going on. As you can see here, all of the sliders are moving normally. The rudder trigger is nice and centered. If you ever do find you are having issues, try to go to Settings and then click Reset to Default. That should resolve most issues, and we do not recommend using the Calibrate feature in Windows unless you find there is a need for it. That can be found in the Settings tab as well, and you click the Calibrate button to run the calibration wizard. Just be very deliberate and be very careful when you do it. If calibration causes problems, you can always click Reset to Default once again. We will talk about the calibration wizard in a future video, but the default recommendation is to simply not use it. A few other things to point out is you'll notice here on the X-axis, Y-axis, the thumbstick screen, you'll notice that little crosshair may not appear to be exactly in the center. I'm not sure why, but the Windows joystick screen always seems to perceive a little bias, even though that's not the case. What really matters is how the controller flies. This is also a good time to talk about dead zones very briefly. A dead zone is essentially an area in the middle where any input is essentially ignored. So because the thumbstick isn't going to exactly center the exact same way every single time, a little bit of dead zone is going to be added by the simulator, and you can always increase it. The same thing with the rudder. Just note, every single controller, big and small, desktop or handheld, requires a dead zone because no two have the same center point. And these dead zones or null zones can be calibrated on each simulator platform. These are topics we will talk about in future videos. But just be aware, we have chosen very high quality sensors with very, very tight dead zones, so they should not be an issue. Also, while this screen is helpful to establish everything is functioning on your controller, try not to get too obsessed with it or fixate on every tiny detail. The most important question is, how does it fly? Flight simulators usually do a pretty good job accounting for variances, big and small, and the Yawman should have very small variance. If you're using Mac OS, we highly recommend using the app Joystick Show. It will perform a similar function to the Windows joystick screen. When you launch it, you should see a very similar type of screen we saw in Windows, where you can move every single axis, move the POV in all 5 directions. You can click buttons and see and make sure that everyone is responding correctly. It also has a nice little feature where it will shade any traveled range for the axes, the hat/POV, and each of the buttons. So that way you can see what coverage you have achieved. If you don't want to pay $1 for the app, you do have another option, assuming that you're using X-Plane on Mac OS. When you fire up X-Plane 12, what you can do from the main menu is you can click on Settings. Make sure that the controller is plugged in before you do this. And if you go to Settings, you'll see that there are different tabs. Go to the joystick tab, and if your Yawman is plugged in, you should see it right here. And you should be able to actually go through the default profile to the right and be able to see each of the buttons and axes moving in tandem with the physical movement. So you should be able to get the full range. You should be able to see the slider, each slider, and the POVs and buttons all moving. So this is another way you can get a status of your controller and each of its functions when you are using X-Plane on Mac. Of course, you can do this with X-Plane on Windows as well. Thank you very much for watching. In future videos, we are going to cover a few other important topics, such as the default profiles for Microsoft Flight Simulator, X-Plane, and Infinite Flight. We will also talk about more advanced topics such as response curves and suiting those to your liking. We will also talk about more advanced calibration features. So stay tuned.